examine this in 3 points. The first is David seeks to show his covenant mercy to Mephibosheth. Second, David promises his covenant mercy to Mephibosheth. And third, David proves his covenant mercy to Mephibosheth. Now let me warn you, if you hear the name Melchizedek mentioned in the sermon, what I meant to say was Mephibosheth. The first point, David seeks to show his covenant mercy to Mephibosheth. We obtain this in verse 1. Let's read this again. And David said, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" We see that there was a rivalry between Saul and David. It was the ditty of those ladies. Saul had slain his thousands and David his 10,000s, that God thought, thinking, wow, this man is going to take my throne. And we see that Saul desired from that day forward to slay David. He was his challenge. He was his archenemy. He was the one upon whom the anointing of God rested. There was an unlikely friendship between Jonathan, the son of Saul, the one that most people would assume to be an heir to the throne. There was a friendship between Jonathan and David. And Jonathan was one who understood that the anointing of God rested upon David. There were promises made between them. There was a deep love between these two men. Jonathan had obligations to David. We see this in 1 Samuel 20, verse 13. He says, "If it please my father to do you harm, may the Lord do so to Jonathan more also, if I do not make it known to you, and send you away, that you may go in safety. And may the Lord be with you, as he has been with my father." So Jonathan had promised that if he ever heard of any plan to slay David, that he would inform him of such things. Jonathan also requested within the covenant of David, he says, "If I am still alive, will you not show me the loving kindness of the Lord, that I may not die? You shall not cut off your loving kindness from my house forever, not even when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth." In 1 Samuel 20. Jonathan also said to David in verse 42 of 1 Samuel 20, "The Lord will be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever." Here was Jonathan, one who willingly gave up this throne, that his friend David might rule, knowing that God's blessings rested upon him. This is the context in which David is showing this kindness to Mephibosheth, because Jonathan requested that he show kindness. Perhaps some would say he went far above and beyond what the covenant required. Some had thought that David had an undue delay in looking for survivors in Jonathan's household. Whether there was or not, we see still that David desired to fulfill it. Better late than never, some might say. And even so, you see the breadth in which he desired to fulfill it. He said, "Is there anyone left in the house of Saul?" He's talking about the broader house, that I may show kindness for the sake of Jonathan. You understand that there was an initiative on David's part. It was not as if crippled Mephibosheth, as a beggar, came to David and said, "Do you remember this covenant you made my father? Well, I'm asking you to show me kindness now." And that David said, "Okay, kindness I will give you." It wasn't that. It was David saying, "I made a promise to my beloved friend who has died, and I want to see that this kindness is shown to those in his household." We see in verse 3, he says, "Is there not still someone in the house of Saul, that I may show the kindness of God to him?" You realize, when David is thinking about manifesting this kindness, he's not thinking, well, how can I show my kindness to this man? He's saying, how can I show the very kindness of God? In many ways, David taking the initiative to show loving kindness and mercy to Mephibosheth. This is in every way the same in which the gospel comes to you and me. God is the one who is the initiator. God is not lost. When people say, I have found God, the follow-up question was, I didn't know he was lost. As if somehow God is lost and we need to find him, that we are the initiators. But no, God is the one who seeks us when we desire to be as far away from him as we possibly can. God is the initiator in the gospel. He seeks you when you are hell-bent on rebellion, when you desire nothing to do with him. And we ask about this Mephibosheth. Who was this man? The answer is he was the son of Jonathan. In 2 Samuel 4, we have an account. There was word given that Jonathan was slain. There was a taking over of the kingship. And the servant was fleeing with Mephibosheth. And somehow he fell and injured his feet. Here, Mephibosheth was hiding out in obscurity in this place called Lo-Debar. Scholars don't know where Lo-Debar is located. You think about the very name, Lo-Debar. Debar in Hebrew means word, or matter, or thing. So the best translation for it would be no pasture or no place. He was off trying to hide in nowhere land. Perhaps this might describe your life. That when God finds you, you are as far as you possibly can be from him. Perhaps you were one who was trying to climb the corporate ladder, trying to find comfort in wealth. Perhaps you were one who was in prison, sick and in the hospital, as far as you possibly could be, trying to hide in obscurity. We see that this was the case of people in the Bible. Consider even John 4, the account of the Samaritan woman. Christ speaks of her life and says, you have had 5 husbands, and the man that you are with now is not your husband. Basically, he's saying, you're cohabiting with someone else. She was far from God when Christ encountered her. So was the Apostle Paul. He was Saul, intent on persecuting the church. Yet on the road to Damascus, there was Jesus speaking to them, saying, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? We have, in this very passage, a conversation regarding Mephibosheth, between Mephibosheth and King David. And note the interaction here for a moment. When David speaks to Ziba, David is always referred to as the king. The king said to Ziba. Yet when David is relating to Mephibosheth, notice he is always referred to as David. He's not the king and a servant. He's David and Mephibosheth. It's as if his very friend were still there, Jonathan. And he would say, oh, this is Uncle David. There was a proximity regarding. And when David speaks to Mephibosheth, he doesn't address him merely as you cripple. He addresses him by name. He says, Mephibosheth. In many ways, this is the same for each one of you. When the gospel comes to you, we acknowledge that the gospel is free. In some cultures, the things that are free are the things that are worthless. Meaning, if it were free, it's because no one's willing to pay for it. But you must understand, the gospel is not free in that way. The gospel is free because you can't pay for it. No one has the currency to pay for it. It's something of infinite value. And God, when he comes to you, He comes to you and calls you by name. We see in John chapter 10, Jesus, who is the great shepherd, knows his sheep by name. It is the personal gospel when he comes to you. He calls you personally. He calls you to himself. He knows everything about you, yet he still offers to you this gospel freely, with no charge. Here was Mephibosheth being called, summoned by this king, King David. It's not known whether or not Mephibosheth was even born when David and Jonathan had made their covenant. We don't know whether or not Mephibosheth knew about this covenant at all. It had been probably 15 or 20 years since the covenant was made. And for some people, it might have been said, well, it's all just forgotten. And not so with David. You understand? For David to call Mephibosheth into his presence, there was only one thing that he would have expected. There is a way that kingdoms are brought down and other ones raised. There's not a kind letter saying, we are taking over now. You have 30 days to move out so that we can occupy the palace. The way it works is that one king will eliminate that king, meaning with extreme prejudice, and all of his sons, probably his barber, all the nobles, everyone involved. We see an example of that in Jeremiah 39, when Nebuchadnezzar took over. Hezekiah was at Riblah. And the last thing that Hezekiah saw with his very eyes, by the order of Nebuchadnezzar, was slay Hezekiah's sons before his eyes, then slay all his nobles, and then gouge out his eyes. That will be the last memory he has having vision, the killing of his own sons. What would Mephibosheth expect here? That's why he was shaking his proverbial boots. What do you expect? You're also born into the wrong household, a descendant of Adam, one who is a covenant breaker. God is one who summons you to his throne. Do you expect that your merits, your kind graces, your likable nature, do you think that that will ingratiate you with God? Are you expecting judgment? Here we see David seeking to show his kindness to Mephibosheth. May that be a picture to you of God's desire to show you kindness through his Son, Jesus Christ. The second point for this evening